will bring the meeting of the Subcommittee on Minnesota Water Quality or Water Policy to order. The first thing on our agenda is to approve the subcommittee meetings from March 4th. If somebody would make that motion.
I'll make that motion.
Thank you, Representative Fisher. Do I have a second?
Second.
I'll second, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. All in favor of approving the agenda, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. The agenda is approved.
Mr. Chair, are you seeing my screen now with the agenda?
Oh, yes, I am now. Yes.
Okay. All right, good.
Okay. So we will start with, and I'm just going to say to all of the presenters today, we need everybody to kind of stay on their scheduled amount of time because we have a lot to go through. And the first thing we have is Dr. John Anfinson to give us a 5-minute update on St. Anthony Falls. So go ahead, sir.
Well, I want to thank Director Stark and the subcommittee and you all for having us back again. On March 4th, I introduced you to the cutoff wall under the Mississippi River at St. Anthony Falls, and you asked many great questions, some of which I was not the most qualified to answer. So thank you for bringing in 2 experts who can. I'll quickly review why the cutoff wall merits your attention. In 1869, a tunnel project triggered a series of riverbed collapses and scour events that nearly destroyed St. Anthony Falls. Between 1874 and 1876, the Corps of Engineers built the cutoff wall to save the falls and navigation above it. Without the wall, the geologic foundation of the falls would have disappeared. And I know Julia Steenberg will address the geology. The cutoff wall saved lumber and flour milling at the falls, which allowed Minneapolis to become the nation's leading flour milling city for 50 years. But navigation above falls ended in 2015 and milling is long gone. But over the past 145 years, St. Anthony Falls, the cutoff wall, and the reservoir it helps create have come to serve new purposes. Since the 1870s, Minneapolis has drawn its water supply from the reservoir, and today the city supplies water to all our parts of 7 suburbs and the international airport. Minneapolis only has a 3-day reserve of water, and they serve over 1 million people daily. The aesthetic power of St. Anthony Falls has drawn billions of dollars in public and private investments. In many ways, another catastrophic failure of the geology at the falls or a cutoff wall failure would bring more devastating results than in the 1870s. As I told you on March 4th, I don't know if the cutoff wall will fail this year, next year, or in another 145 years. No one does, and that should worry us, given the potential consequences. How many of your constituents work in Minneapolis or in one of the suburbs it supplies with water? How many use the international airport? How many attend one of the universities or colleges or have been cared for at one of the hospitals? How many have attended sporting events? Why don't we know the condition of the wall or the geology? Well, the direct answer is that no one accepts ownership of the cutoff wall, which means no one has inspected it or maintained it for 145 years. No one has examined the integrity of the surrounding geology. It means we don't know if a federal or state agency is responsible for oversight. Consequently, no federal or state agency is enforcing the laws and regulations that would normally apply, like regular safety and condition inspections, routine monitoring and maintenance. Who could own the cutoff wall? As of right now, there's really 2 scenarios. First, one entity owns it. It could be the Corps of Engineers or some entity that assumed responsibility from the Corps after they finished the wall. I've seen no evidence that the Corps signed an agreement with the Millers, the city, or anyone else. Still, there could be one. Generally, the Corps owns the navigation structures it builds. The second alternative, absent the first, is that multiple entities own the wall. All the entities that own land over the wall own their portion of the wall below it. If this is the case, the state owns a section of the walls under the riverbed and therefore the largest portion of it. For an April 1 meeting, the Corps brought together those entities who own facilities at the falls and who operate, maintain, and inspect structures associated with the surface dam. The Corps stated that their purpose was to have a unified response should an emergency arise with any of their facilities. And this is really an important and welcome step. But since no one acknowledges ownership of the cutoff wall, no one reported on it, and no one had considered their responsibility in an emergency. If it failed, what entity would initiate and coordinate the response actions? And why would they have the responsibility to do so? Who would get the permits and hire the contractors? Should we wait until a crisis occurs and then try and answer these questions? Or could we avert a future crisis by answering them now? The ownership question, however, doesn't have to prevent the study. The federal, state, and local governments could work together to examine the wall and surrounding geology. Some argue that a study isn't needed, or they argue it can't be done safely, effectively, and at a reasonable cost. I know Brian Herridge is going to address these concerns. Dams of the Cutoff Wall's magnitude require inspections every 1 to 2 years. It's been 145 years. We need a study, we need to know who owns it, and we need an emergency action plan. So thanks. I'm going to turn it back to Director Jim Stark to introduce the next speaker.
Thank you, sir. Jim, the next person I have on the agenda is Julia Steenberg with the Minnesota Geological Survey.
That's correct.
Julia, if you want to go right ahead. And we have you down for 10 minutes, Julia.
Got it. All right. You hear me okay? Can you see my screen?
We
Yeah.
can.
Great. Let me get to a spot where I can make it bigger. All right. Do you see it in a normal mode?
In normal mode, yes, not
Okay.
presentation.
Mine is presenter mode, but I just want to make sure you're seeing what you should be. Okay, thank you. Here we go. Thanks for having me here today, and thanks, John, for that great overview. I'm happy to be with you today to talk about the geology and geologic history of the falls. And I'll start here. Let's see if I can get the hang of this. All right. Anthony Falls, obviously located in downtown Minneapolis along the Mississippi River, was once a natural waterfall prior to construction of the dam. And it was the only natural waterfall on the entire Mississippi River. The dam, or horseshoe dam, the upper dam we call it, was built on the limestone cap of the natural falls. And the falls, as John just said, are significant for many reasons: long cultural and spiritual significance for Native tribes. They provided natural source of hydropower, supporting the milling industry of the 1800s and spurring the growth of the city of Minneapolis. Extended navigation up the stream, and the Minneapolis Water Department relies on the Mississippi River for its intake and storage in the reservoir above the falls, as well as St. Paul Water Services. Sorry, I'll just go through that quick because that was an overview. So you can see here in this photo from 1860 what the falls looked like before the dam structure was built. The falls flowed over the Platteville Formation, which is a resistant limestone unit with a soft, thin shale bed beneath it called the Glenwood Shale here. And then there's a soft sandstone unit below that called the St. Peter Sandstone. And so a waterfall will naturally form when there's a softer unit below a resistant unit, where continued flow leads to undercutting and overhang collapse, creating a gorge-like valley as the falls retreat upstream, which is what we have. The geology you see at the falls area here is the same geology you see all over the Twin Cities and Minneapolis-St. Paul area. The same sequence of Platteville, Glenwood, and St. Peter can be seen in exposures from Columbia Heights to the north, along the River Gorge through the U of M campuses, at the Minnehaha Falls, and south of downtown St. Paul along Shepherd Road. When the full Platteville limestone is present, it's approximately 25 to 30 feet thick It has 4 members or characteristic layers known from the bottom to top as the Pecatonica, the Mifflin, the Hidden Falls, and the Magnolia. And in terms of fracturing and stability of the limestone, you can see from the photo how each of those members really have a different pattern or way of breaking up that relates to the properties within the rock itself. And the Magnolia breaks up into small blocks, and the Hidden Falls breaks up in more as a crumbled nature with curved fractures. The Mifflin is a well-consolidated layer, breaking up in large blocks. Most fractures in the Mifflin span the whole 12-foot thick member. The lowermost unit we call the Pecatonica is only a foot thick or so. And you can see it sort of spalls off on its own or sometimes breaks off with the rest of the Mifflin blocks. The vertical fractures in the Platteville all have preferred orientations in the northwest, northeast directions, but there are slight differences between the individual members and differences in how far they're spaced apart from each other. Limestone, since it's made up of calcium carbonate, reacts weakly with natural rainwater and dissolves away the rock over time. And at the surface, fractures are enhanced as well from freeze and thaw and dissolution. So as fractures go further back into the rock mass, they get progressively smaller into just hairline features. But understanding those fracture patterns of the rock can be key to understanding the stability of the rock and how it's likely to break up over time. So here's the bedrock geologic map of the area showing the distribution of the geologic units in the subsurface. The Decorah Shale is in green. That's the unit that's younger and sits above the Platteville Formation. And the Platteville Formation is gray. So here's those same geographic locations for your reference in the falls here. Anywhere that's not green or gray, or Decorah or Platteville, are older units where those units have been eroded away. So these rocks are part of a larger sequence of rock layers that occur in a basin-like shape called the Twin Cities Basin. They are mostly composed of sandstone, shales, and carbonate rock and reach thicknesses of nearly 1,000 feet thick in the area. And they store and supply our regions outside of Minneapolis and St. Paul with our water resources. And on this cross-section, you can also see the variable thickness of glacial sediments that overlie these Paleozoic bedrock units. And there's places where the bedrock is near the surface, like we see along the falls. And then there are plenty of places where bedrock is deeply buried in channels and so on. Glacial sediments cover the bedrock tell a much more recent geologic story where large ice sheets blanketed the area from 2 million years ago to only about 10,000 years ago. The glaciers went through several episodes of melting, retreat, and re-advance across the landscape, further eroding these bedrocks units and developing a drainage network. So as the last glaciers left the area, massive glacial lakes formed, including Glacial Lake Agassiz, Glacial Lake Aiken, and Glacial Lake Duluth. And those lakes, as they eventually drained, cut large, wide, deep river valleys along their path, which later became our modern river valleys as we know it here. Glacial River Warren was a massive river that drained Glacial Lake Agassiz, and now the Minnesota River follows its path. As Glacial River Warren cut its path in the Twin Cities area, beginning about 10,000 years ago, a massive waterfall with nearly a 200-foot drop began, based on some of what this figure shows. It basically was flowing over the resistant Platteville limestone and encountered a buried river channel near downtown St. Paul. And that buried river channel was full of loose sand and gravel sediments, and a massive waterfall was created as it easily eroded those sediments in that channel. And the waterfall retreated upstream by undercutting the St. Peter sandstone and breaking off pieces of Platteville. The path the falls took can be seen in these figures from downtown St. Paul up through here near the confluence, and then up as the Mississippi River goes up by the falls there to the place where it stays today, right? So if we take a closer look at the falls area, we see just how close the falls were to ending naturally. About 1,500 feet here of Platteville that we think still exists underneath the river. The Platteville, again, is this gray color. That's where it exists in the subsurface, and the St. Peter sandstone is that tan color. And then wherever rock is exposed at the surface is highlighted in white. So based on historical accounts from 1860 to 1856, it can be estimated that the falls were retreating at a rate of about 6 feet per year prior to any construction of the dam. And at that rate, if you want to do the math, within 100 years from today, the falls would have likely been gone. Looking at a cross section that goes up the river valley, you can see the small amount of Platteville that's there. This section from west to east basically follows this black line up the river valley. So you can see just how small amount of Platteville is actually there. And then what Platteville is there is dipping at an angle. The falls only have the Mifflin and Pecatonica layers. Everything else above it has been eroded. So there's not as thick of a section. And as you make your way all the way up towards just towards Nicollet Island, there's only about, it thins to nothing here, where there's only several feet that exist. So it's hard to see exactly what's going on with the geology at the falls, since there's all this infrastructure and water, obviously, but there's times when the river level has been very low and the upper Mifflin can be seen in the Horseshoe Dam. There's a photo of that upper Mifflin that you can see when the river is very dry. And you can see that those are, you're looking at an aerial image of vertical fractures in the top of the Mifflin. And those fractures likely go all the way through the Mifflin. And the historical collapses related to the Eastman Tunnel that John Amundsen has mapped out and discussed last time are all very close to the edge of this Nicollet Island, where the Platteville is only a few feet thick. So just alongside of the dam, this photo shows the exposure at Mill Ruins Park. It may be hard to tell with all the old mill infrastructure in place, but this is the Mifflin in the photo right here. This is in place Mifflin rock. And these are, this is stuff that's been built up around it since, but this is in place. And this is actually the Glenwood Shale through here and the St. Peter Sandstone here. You can see outcrops like this all along the area, and it's what we'd expect the rock would look like behind the dam as well. You can see that the basal layer, the Pecatonica, has broken off in places. And also you can see vertical joints are going all the way through the Mifflin. There's also a spring flowing out of the rock here. You can go to Mill Ruins Park and often see that. You can barely see it through here, but it's where all the vegetation is growing. Almost see the water there. This is groundwater in the Platteville that moves through the fractures and emanates at the bluff edges along the river. And you can just see get a sense of what happens to the rock near the wet areas. It leads to more weathering and erosion and dissolution of the rock as it's sort of eroding away back here near the spring. In general, groundwater situation is like this cartoon suggests. The Platteville water is perched and held up by the more impermeable Glenwood Shale. So spring water in the Platteville is very common, flowing through fractures emanating at the bluff edge. Then you have this dry zone of St. Peter in unsaturated conditions that allowed the tunneling and all sorts of other things going on in the upper St. Peter in the area. And at some depth, usually consistent with the water level of the river, the St. Peter becomes fully saturated. So I think I'll end there. Hopefully it was some geologic context, and I'll take any questions, or I'll leave it to you, Jim.
Thank you, Julia. We're going to hold the questions till after everyone has talked today. So we'll move on to Brian Harridge. If I'm saying that wrong, correct me, please. But go ahead, Brian. We have you down for a 10-minute presentation.
Thank you. I'll just share my screen here. Okay, folks, thank you very much. I really appreciate the chance to talk. You know, I was born in St. Paul and ended up going to Ramsey Junior High School. I had an 8th grade science teacher named Mark Wanvig, who was a geophysicist and a geologist, as well as an Army guy. Anyway, can't tell you how important 8th grade science teachers are. I ended up going to St. Thomas and then went over to Basin Instruments in St. Louis Park, and sort of serendipitously met Harold Mooney, the grandfather of engineering geophysics from the University of Minnesota. and worked with his first graduate student, Paul Farnham, to luckily develop something that came out of digital audio when they started recording sound. The A to D converters they used, the stereo A to Ds, we made a seismograph out of and started making very high resolution pictures of the earth like the oil industry does. And so I want to share some of the stuff we've learned and see how it might apply to your problem here. You know, we're talking about seismic imaging today, and let me just, let's see. Pointer options. Sorry. So we do that with a seismic source and then some receivers, and we'll hit the ground or create some energy that can either reflect like an echo or refract. And there's a thing called ground roll, which was always a problem and suddenly is a solution. Let's see here. Okay. We manufacture seismic sources and send them all over the world. I have one going to Egypt today. Back in the 80s, we kind of collected data and we measured time distances and typed them into a program and got cross sections, which showed us layers and velocities. And that was all pretty helpful. In 2000, we started making three-dimensional images because the oil industry was making them and we had systems to do it. And here we could see layers and get maps and see highs and lows and fractures and faults and all kinds of fabulous stuff from the oil industry technologies that were just sitting there for us. So I started making detailed fracture maps with my seismic data, and wow, it's shocking stuff. So let me just quickly try to get in the weeds for a second because it's a little important. For years, we did 2D seismic. We'd hammer and reflect data along a line and record things with a line of geophones, and we'd get 2D sections, and they were wonderful. They really helped us figure out a lot of stuff. But it turns out you need to do 3D to really understand what's going on. And this involves using multiple seismic sources and multiple receivers in a 2D plan to collect 3D seismic data that we can then get in our computers and process. I want to show you why it's so important. The reason we collect 3D data is to migrate it, to apply 3D migration. It's critical. So to try to show you that today, I'm going to use a modeling program or example. We're just going to look at line 6 over my little geologic model here, the bold line 6 here. If we shoot 2D over that, what we really get is this raw data in panel B. And while we see a lot of the structures, it's really got a lot of artifacts like this back red fault block here. It's not well representative. The top's wrong, the angle's wrong. This is a diffraction that shouldn't be there. This yellow dome in here isn't even under our line. It's off to the side, but there's nothing we can do about it. So it's kind of a image full of artifacts. Well, if we apply 2D migration in our computer, we improve it a lot. Now you can see things have improved a lot, but we still have this yellow dome that's not under our line 6, so it shouldn't be there. 3D migration gets us this. It's almost perfect. And it's astonishing what you see when you go out in the real world and take a look at these things. So when we do this, we get to have a volume of data where now I can look at inlines or cross lines or any arbitrary line I draw with my mouse. I can look at plan views, and man, can I see stuff. Out at Edwards Air Force Base, I've worked for the Navy, the Air Force, and I've worked for the CIA, the FBI, the Israelis, and the Department of Homeland Security, and that's all this year. So this is from a while ago where we chasing DNAPL out there, solvents, and they wanted me to map the lows, and we went right in here and found this stuff. So when you do 3D seismic, what you see that you don't really see on other forms of imaging is this here. This is a chair diagram. So this is the back of the chair in depth, and this is the seat of the chair in plan view, a map, and this is the legs in front of a chair. And when you collect the detailed seismic data and migrate it correctly, you see things you do not see in any other images. These small aperture faults, normal faults, you don't see them in 2D because the Fresnel zone is so large, they get masked over. In 3D, we're bouncing energy off a very small point, a very small Fresnel zone. So all these things show up. What do we see? We see a lot of northeast, northwest faults. We see the earth is fractured ubiquitously, systematically, everywhere. This is a time slice from Oman, from the oil and gas industry. You can sort of see the northeast, not sort of, you can see the northeast, northwest structural grain of this. This is 30 kilometers. This is not a Rorschach of exploding, zoo animals. This is Earth. All the brittle planets we see, including the moon's fracture 45 degrees to the spin axis. All of them. You ever noticed this before, how square North America is? And look at these things. Look at Asia. It's just a perfect northeast, northwest cutout. Here's your site. These river directions are not an accident. They're all directed by geology. If you let me in there and make an image of your site, it's going to look like this. You're going to see a hole. And when I exaggerate some of the fractures that are in there, by the way, I appreciate the prelude to all this. It really helped. The geologic information was fabulous. And it correlates to everything I'm telling you right now. If you take a close look, I'm going to be able to go in. This is interesting. The reason you have a problem here is because your earth is fractured. It's the bottom of your problem here. And
Brian, if I can just interrupt you for a minute, you're going past your 10-minute
yeah, I know.
Time allowed. So if you could wrap it up, I'd appreciate it.
I will.
Thank you.
What we'll see if we make an image of your site is that your site's fractured, and I can get in there and drill holes and pump this thing full of grout, and it'll go really well because we know all about this from fracking and the way geologic terrain works. This is a record showing surface wave. These days we use surface wave. We collected some down there at St. Anthony. This is how this works. We get models of the shear wave strength from the surface waves. This is a sinkhole in surface wave strength. This is a tunnel section right from downtown Minneapolis next to the Twin Stadium in surface wave. So we collected some data on another project with surface waves, and this is right in your area. These are fractures. You can see them in the bedrock here. This is a very large one. We could revisit this. This is what your site will look like. This is how we can inject grout and use surface wave data to see how we improve the strength. This is change in strength after 4 days after grouting, change in strength after 2 months. This is all surface wave technology. We'd use this boat, this vibrator. And I appreciate the time. You guys can contact me here. Appreciate your time today.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate the information. We're going to move on to Dr. Bonnie Keeler. Bonnie, we have you down for 15 minutes.
Representatives?
Yes, sir.
If I could, please, we have Director Smith here from the DNR, Water and Ecology, and she would like to say a few words relative to this issue. So if we could, this would probably be a good time for her to make her testimony.
By all means, go right ahead.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Chair, Director Stark, and subcommittee members. My name is Katie Smith, and I'm the Director of Ecological and Water Resources at the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources. Thanks for the opportunity to be here today. I just have some very brief comments to share this morning. DNR has met with Dr. Ann Finson, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, Representative Robbins, and Xcel Energy on this matter. We're aware of the concerns that some have, and we appreciate that concern and interest. As we've all learned, there's a complex property history here, as well as technical and regulatory questions that really need additional analysis. Historically, DNR has not regulated the cutoff wall. We do have some additional questions for the Corps, and those conversations should help inform our assessment from both a structural and regulatory perspective. At this time, we haven't drawn any final conclusions, but we can say at this point, we have not received any evidence or heard evidence from the Corps or Xcel that there's an immediate threat. So we don't see it as an urgent matter. However, we will continue to gather information and look into this situation. And if the committee has questions for DNR, please let us know. And if I can't answer them today, we can get you answers for a subsequent meeting, or we can send them in writing on your preference. But in the meantime, we'll continue to work with interested parties on this matter. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We will now move on to Dr. Bonnie Keeler with the University of Minnesota. Go ahead, doctor.
All right, thanks for the invitation. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here, and you can tell me if you can see my slides.
Yes.
Okay.
We can see them. So.
Do you see them as presenter view, or do you see the slides themselves?
Yes, it's full screen.
Okay, great. So thanks for the opportunity to be here. I also want to acknowledge I'm coming to you from Bridgewater Township, and both of my representatives, Senator Draheim and Representative Lippert, are on this call. So thanks for your service and interest in water policy. I'm a faculty member at the Humphrey School, and I co-direct the Center for Science, Technology, and Environmental Policy. My expertise is in environmental economics, and I do a lot of policy analysis. So the purpose of my talk today is to share a little bit about the context of how we understand the benefits of water policy. And I'll put that in the context of the Clean Water Act, which turns 50 actually this year in 2022. Give a brief overview of how we actually measure the benefits of water policies. We determine whether the investments we're making are good investments, if we're getting a positive return on those investments. Some of the challenges that water specifically poses to that toolkit of policy analysis, and then some implications, I think, for both Minnesota and how we assess our own water policies, as well as at the federal level. So as I mentioned, in October of this year will be the 50th anniversary of the Clean Water Act. This is President Nixon signing the Clean Water Act after he has had his original veto overridden. And this policy is designed to restore, maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the nation's waters. Since the Reagan administration, we have always had to, at the federal level, justify that the proposed rules or regulations pass a benefit cost test, which means that the economists at the EPA and elsewhere have to determine whether any new rules are actually going to deliver more benefits than they cost taxpayers. So given that we're 50 years on, it's a good time to reflect back on what we've learned about the benefits and costs of water investments, water policies. This is an image from a colleague of mine, Dave Kaiser, who has analyzed the expenditures that the US has made on water policy over the past several decades. So we've spent nearly $5 trillion of public and private money on water quality since the 1970s. At the federal level, that's the most that's been spent on any environmental issue. So we spend quite a bit of money on water quality as a percentage of GDP. Economists have not actually been able to pull together a lot of evidence that demonstrates that these water quality policies have generated a positive return on investment. In fact, what we found based on a review of 20 different studies, that the benefit to cost ratio is actually only about 3.7, so significantly less than 1. And this isn't just a finding from the US. Economists working in Europe have also failed to find a positive benefit to cost ratio for the European Union's water framework. So many people find this surprising. I think it raises some questions about whether we're making good decisions about how we spend our taxpayer dollars on water quality investments, if the benefits are worth the costs, and if we should be moving instead of moving some of those investments to other public goods, whether it's other kinds of environmental policies or other social policies. This comes at a time when we still face a lot of ongoing threats to water quality. As you all know, we don't have rivers that catch on fire like the Cuyahoga in Cleveland, but we do have a lot of second order water quality problems. We've got new contaminants to worry about like PFAS, we've got microplastics and pharmaceuticals and chloride that's ending up in our lakes, rivers, and streams, zebra mussels, aquatic invasive species, et cetera. These are expensive to remove, they're difficult to treat, and that means we're always uncertain about whether the future investments we make given our limited resources are going to be the right investments, or which of these many problems and many locations we should be allocating our dollars. This comes on the heels of an article a couple days ago that found Mississippi River as one of the most endangered rivers in the US. So I think we're always facing challenges to try and figure out how much money should we spend on trying to address the multitude of water quality problems we face at local, state, and federal levels. So that's the context. I want to just briefly review the toolkit that we offer to analyze if the benefits of these policies are a good return on investment. So what do we do when we look under the hood of how we do benefit cost analysis? So there's kind of a traditional tool, but then the set of tools that focus on efficiency. The Biden administration in a couple of early memos have advocated for a much more inclusive approach to policy analysis, recognizing that a lot of the key benefits of environmental policies are not easily quantified using traditional benefit cost analysis. So they're asking for policy analysts to do a better job thinking about regulatory benefits that are impossible to quantify and to address the distributional consequences of regulations with a particular focus on the burdens to disadvantaged, vulnerable, or marginalized communities. And that was followed by further guidance under the Justice 40 initiative, which aims to deliver 40% of the overall benefits of federal investments to disadvantaged communities. And agencies are very much right now trying to figure out how to implement that Justice 40 guidance, especially with the new infrastructure spending bill. A lot of that authority of how Justice 40 is ultimately decided and how those resources are allocated will fall to the states. So Minnesota will have an opportunity to decide how they want to interpret this Justice 40 statute. I want to argue that water poses a real particular set of challenges when it comes to policy analysis. And I'll mention four. First is that we have a whole diversity of values with water quality. This isn't like the particulate matter problem or air pollution or even climate change. We're talking about material and immaterial values, recreation, health, spirituality, cultural associations with water, a sense of place. The second is that water affects a diversity of endpoints from lakes, rivers, streams, wetlands, groundwater. The third is that we have to think about a diversity of contaminants, nitrogen, phosphorus, sediment, temperature, contaminants of emerging concern. And the last is that there's a diversity of beneficiaries when we talk about water quality. It's homeowners, it's recreational anglers, it's anyone who drinks water, it's tribal communities. And so all these different dimensions make capturing the value of clean water on all the different endpoints across all those different groups really a challenge. So I'll briefly summarize two of the main ways that economists actually measure whether a water policy is a good return on investment. And two of those are hedonics and travel cost models. So a travel cost model, there's two images here, a report from Iowa and the Iowa Lakes study. Essentially what they've done is ask residents in an annual survey which lakes they go to in Iowa, and the lakes represented in the little image there of Iowa are all the lakes of Iowa. They have many fewer lakes than we do here, but people do go to lakes in Iowa. And then we figure out how much further are people traveling to lakes of higher quality than lakes of lower quality. And from that information, we can infer how people are revealing the preference they have for clean water. So we can convert that to dollars based on expenditures around travel. That's one way to figure out what is clean water worth and what are the benefits of improving lake water quality in this case. The other way is to look at property values. So if you analyze the values of properties that are adjacent to water bodies, we know that if you control for granite countertops and number of bedrooms, that houses that are located on clean lakes, clear lakes are worth more. They can get a higher price than houses that are on lakes of lower quality. And so from that, we again are understanding how people are revealing the preference they have for clean water by paying more for those properties. So that's another line of evidence that suggests that water quality is actually adding economic value to society. And the last big bucket are surveys that essentially ask people to state their preference for clean water. So we might send a survey out and ask, there's a proposed tax referendum. It's going to raise your property taxes by $100 a year, but it'll go towards improving water quality in these water bodies. Would you be willing to pay for that tax? Or we give people a survey that shows a bunch of these lakes, blue to green, and we ask, how much more would you be willing to pay each year in taxes to move X number of your lakes from the green category into the blue category? Right, so very simple survey designed to say, what are you willing to pay? What would you trade off? And from that, we infer what values people place on water quality. So if you look at the history of economic analyses of the Clean Water Act, and I've just pulled a couple of those regulatory reviews from the past, you can see that we have actually not been able to quantify a lot of the benefits of water quality policies. So all of the yellow highlighted texts are places where we found we have not been able to quantify the benefits. And so you see that throughout, we're missing a lot of benefits in these benefit cost analyses. So then just a couple of implications of this, the methods that we have, because they're focused on things like recreation and property values, those studies do a much better job of capturing the preferences of the rich over the preferences of the poor. So if you're just looking at lakeshore property owners, here's a $4 million estate on Lake of the Isles. If we're going to improve that water quality in that particular lake, it'll generate a lot of benefits for that homeowner. But I don't think that most of us think we should be spending all of our water quality dollars on Lake of the Isles or Lake Minnetonka. And then I mentioned the diversity of different water values. The economic tools that we have don't do a very good job of capturing things like cultural values, the value of sacred sites, the value of cultural associations with certain types of recreation. And so those kinds of values don't fit well in that traditional economic toolkit, and therefore they don't really appear on our balance sheet or get considered when we're doing cost benefit assessments. Coming back to the environmental justice issue, we know from a recent survey, this is from 2020, from the Midwest Environmental Justice Network, that asked environmental organizations, environmental justice organizations throughout the Midwest, what were their priority areas of concern for their communities. And I thought it was interesting that water was the #1 issue of concern for environmental justice groups, more than air or food or health. So I think one of the questions here is what methods, given there's some challenges associated with our traditional toolkit of economic analyses to assess the benefits of water quality policies, what are some alternative methods that we could use to complement those traditional benefit cost assessments? My lab at the U has been doing work on participatory methods. We've been doing stakeholder work. We've been looking at social media, we're doing interviews, workshops. We've done a lot of surveys across the state. And it's been interesting to see how different results you get from using these different methods. For example, when we do surveys or focus groups, we find that drinking water is the #1 issue of concern for Minnesota residents, followed by protecting waters for fish and wildlife, and then not sending pollution downstream. And you'll remember that these are benefits that aren't really captured at all in those sort of traditional economic tools that focus on recreation and property values. So I'll just close with a couple of thoughts on the future of water benefits analysis that I think are relevant both at the state, local, and federal level as we're all considering future water policies. What do we know about if they're going to be a good return on investment, or how do we look retrospectively and ask, have we made the right choices with the water policies that we have adopted? The first is we clearly need to quantify more benefits. We have only been capturing a very narrow slice of what how water benefits people and economies, and we need to do more to capture a more diverse suite of benefits. And that means we need to use a diversity of methods and can't just rely on methods that look at property values and recreational behavior, especially if we're going to be attentive to those distributional concerns in the Justice 40 and Modernizing Regulatory Review memo. And then I think ultimately there's an open question of who decides if a policy is good and what we define as good. And there's an ongoing debate in policy analysis about how much this kind of assessment should be left to the technocrats, to either the scientists or the economists, policy analysts, or to politicians to make decisions when these values are highly uncertain and there's a lot of challenges with the methodological toolkits that we have. So I'm going to close there and I will open it up for questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Keeler. Before questions, we'll move on to Lanya Ross with the Metropolitan Council. Go ahead, Lanya.
All right. Thank you for the invitation to share today. I'm going to try to get things working the right way. Bear with me.
And Lanya, while you're doing that, we have you down for 15 minutes this morning.
Fantastic. Quick question. Are you seeing a full screen or are you also seeing my notes?
Full screen.
Excellent. Let me start my timer as well. This has been a really great presentation and I appreciate all the topics we've all heard so far today. I am here from the Metropolitan Council, regional planning agency for the Twin Cities metropolitan area, to share a report from our Metro Area Water Supply Advisory Committee, who are a very diverse group of stakeholders who advise our work on water supply planning. And they have been wrestling with a lot of the types of issues that we talk about here today. And so they have a report that was published earlier this year that presents an approach and some recommendations for tackling some of these. Just as a sort of grounding in why we do this work and who the committee is, I wanted to share that this is a metropolitan area, Minnesota statute that does require this committee to advise the council and then report starting in 2017 and every 5 years to both the Metropolitan Council and, for the statutory language, to the Legislative Water Commission, about the work that's been done and any recommendations. And so we are excited about this particular report. Although it is required by statute, the timing is very good because we are beginning to think about the update of regional policies and plans, which is triggered by the 2020 census. And so the timing for this is very helpful and is going to be very influential as we think about updating both policies and those system plans that implement those policies and provide technical assistance and guidance to our communities. I talked a little bit about the Metro Area Water Supply Advisory Committee, affectionately known as MOSAC, and their Technical Advisory Committee. And I just want to highlight how this is a really unique resource that the council taps for the planning expertise and partnerships. But it's also a resource for state and local water supply leaders to draw from. This is a committee that represents the 11 county metropolitan area. It's broader than just the 7 counties, and that includes counties upstream of the metro area. That's the watershed above the intakes for Minneapolis and St. Paul. So it's a very broad geographic perspective. And the committee includes representatives from all the state's water agencies, along with appointees from county and local units of government, and from both Minneapolis and water utilities. And so it's also got a very broad range of perspectives in terms of governments and utility operation. And the Technical Advisory Committee adds additional technical expertise to the conversations. As they do the work, underpinning all of it is the recognition that water supply, as we just heard too about water values, is absolutely critical for the function of our communities, and it touches in one way or another on many different aspects of our community work, not just water supply, but also watershed work, land use, housing, parks, transportation decisions. And so the work of the committee is really influencing work in many different areas. And these are topics that have come up in committee conversations over the years and are reflected in this report. The report recommendations and content builds on a vision of water supply sustainability that was first described and articulated in the MOSAC approved Twin Cities Master Water Supply Plan, which was approved in 2015. And I wanted to share that with all of you because we included it in this current report. And so went through some review of this and added it again. And this understanding of sustainability builds on state definitions, but it also kind of adds some nuances, particularly as it includes the role of water supply and water infrastructure. So the committee sees the region's water supply as sustainable when our water users are maximizing their use of our existing investments. We've put a lot of investment into our water infrastructure across the region. We want to get as much value out of that as we can, as long as it is within the sustainable limits of our available sources. So where that demand exceeds the sustainable limit on the sources currently being used, we have water conservation and water efficiency opportunities to manage that demand. And we also want to explore other approaches where we can balance multiple water sources where they're available. Not all communities have multiple sources available, but where they are, take advantage of that. To do this, the committee recognizes we need to continue working to align agency directions. We need to recognize the uncertainty in these systems. So we can't assume that there is going to be one future. We have to think about the possibility that there may be some unexpected events. And the goal being to recognize that uncertainty and to constantly be thinking, how can we minimize risks? So that groundwater levels are maintained in a way that we are preventing interference with other users, protecting aquifers so that we are not spreading contamination around by changing groundwater flow directions, and also protecting surface water flows and water levels. So that's the committee's vision for water sustainability. And so that affects what we're ultimately working toward with the recommendations. The report shares some considerations for both Metropolitan Council and legislators and others. So as you consider the information in this report, the committee would like to highlight the importance of thinking about how funding is needed for public water suppliers' emergency responses and for proactive infrastructure and upgrades across the region. The need to support coordination across political boundaries, which is absolutely critical because, of course, water moves freely between communities, and one community's water supply decisions impact others. The committee also recognized the importance of highlighting that proposals have the most impact when they can advance multiple goals at once. There's the recognition of connections between water quality, land use, groundwater, surface water interaction, water supply infrastructure. And so when we do work trying to advance our goals in all of those areas, always looking for opportunities to remove regulatory barriers that are, so we can help advance our goals, and being grounded in information from our water utilities and resource managers to craft the most effective legislation and project proposals. The committees are highlighting 4 specific goal areas, and this came about through an iterative process over the years. After reviewing the past committee work, our staff talked with committee members about their priorities, and the committees used this to focus on these 4 specific topics and develop some specific goals related to them. And so they are really focused on water quality, land use and water supply connections, understanding and managing groundwater, surface water interactions, and advancing our goals for water supply infrastructure. And a lot of project proposals and ideas were shared. And this slide is illustrating the framework for action that was developed to achieve those goals and to help organize all of the different work that was proposed. So the committee identified 4 general steps and related objectives, and the report discusses this in more detail. And one of the takeaways is this recognition that there's no single effort that's going to achieve our goals and visions. These recommended action steps, specific projects done together in a coordinated way, support better risk management across the region's full water supply system, from source to abstraction to use to reclamation in our wastewater system and back into the environment. So looking at risk to our full water supply system is embedded in this. And again, this is sort of the framework. The report includes more details that you may be interested in. I would like to particularly focus you on table 1. And in early December, the committee did a lot of work in this area. And in early December of last year, we held a meeting of all of our sub-regional water supply work groups and asked them what is top of mind for them right now. What are their water supply concerns? And so a few of the examples we heard are shared here. And it was important and it was good for us to see that they reflect the topics and concerns that were raised by MOSAC and TAC over the past year. It was a good check of the usefulness of the committee's work and the report recommendations, that it was reflecting the individual community challenges that are also being experienced across the region. These local stakeholders will also continue to be engaged in this work as specific projects emerge from the committee's recommendations. And so over the next few slides, I'm just going to illustrate some pieces of the report information just as a teaser so that you can go into the report later and learn more. But this is an example from table 1 of the report. It's a detailed list of activities that were recommended by the committees to address challenges and achieve goals in those 4 focus areas. And so the activities are listed kind of by the steps of that framework for action. So you can see here the list for the activities that were associated with evaluating mitigation measures. And we tried to identify how a particular action could serve multiple goals. The point is that when we strategically plan work like this, these committee recommended activities can inform one another and then work together to advance those high-level committee goals. Of course, this work will be refined with input from both the committees, our sub-regional water supply work groups, and other stakeholders as we start to implement this in the coming this year and beyond. The report also includes almost 24 figures with some supporting information, and I think those are really good resources if you're interested in learning more about a particular aspect of the region's water supply. So I'll just share a few here just to pique your interest. The report includes information about community water sources, how water use differs by the different community types we have here in the Twin Cities metropolitan area, how regional systems like our parks relate to source water protection areas. Our parks are almost entirely connected to different waters. We build them around our lakes, we build them along our rivers and streams. And so there's an intimate connection between park management and water resources and water supply. There's information about pollution sensitivity, and that's just to illustrate a few pieces of information that the committee wants to provide as the context for doing water supply planning work. So this report and other Met Council water supply planning work can provide you, I hope, good information you can draw into the work you are doing. The full report is on MOSAC's webpage, and I included the link here on the slide. And the water supply planning group at the Met Council also has many other resources that may be of interest. And so you can find our various research efforts, information about water conservation and efficiency grants, other planning efforts on our website, which is very strongly directed by work of MOSAC and TAC over the years. And if you're interested in some of the past work we've done in 2020, Metropolitan Council also just did a report summarizing everything we've done since 2005. So that's also a resource to draw from. Thank you. I think I stayed in time, I hope.
Thank you.
You did great. Thank you, Mrs. Ross. Mr. Stark, before we go to your legislative update, I think we'll open it up to member questions. So the first hand I see up is Senator Weber.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have two questions for Ms. Ross. First, I'm assuming you heard the presentation regarding St. Anthony Falls and the issues around that. Is that an element or an item that's on the discussion table at the Met Council as they talk about water supply?
That was a fantastic presentation. The specific challenge for St. Anthony Falls was not addressed by the committees. The concept of source water protection and recognizing the vulnerability of Minneapolis and St. Paul intakes. So that broader conversation has been a part of conversation, and it really relating to how are we improving our source water protection and paying attention to what are some of the water quality risks for our drinking water supply systems would be some of the most direct connections there, but that particular topic was not discussed.
Excuse me, I would just mention that as a legislator, I would say that if the Met Council is not considering potential risks in that area, that is something they should be discussing and considering. And the second point I wanted to bring up was recently in a Environment and Natural Resources Policy Committee meeting, we had a presentation from people from the Lake Elmo area. Lake Elmo had wished to be more of a rural community. However, the Met Council came in and mandated that they increase their population density and thereby increase the number of people living there. And now they have a short water supply and they are not allowed to drill a new well. So is the Met Council rethinking its density requirements for these communities? Because in my opinion, the Met Council shares part of the responsibility for their water shortage at this point.
I would like to acknowledge that that is a big challenge, right? The connection between land use and water supply planning and the need to more strongly link those two things has been identified as a need to improve. And so that is where the goal for land use and water supply interactions was raised. As we update our regional plans, I expect that this will definitely be I know that this will be part of our conversations. And I will bring this comment back as well to our leadership, and in particular as well, our leadership in the community development and local planning assistance area.
Very good, thank you.
Thank you. Any follow-up, Senator?
No, I'm fine right now.
Okay, thank you. Representative Fisher.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And mine is going to be questions picking up along the line that Senator Weber started in the East and Northeast Metro with the water supply. Part of it will start with going back to trying to get an understanding from, I believe, Dr. Keeler on the value of Minnesota water. I was kind of wondering is when you folks are valuing water, it sounded like there was, when you were trying to value water, were you looking at it from the drinking water component? Is what is the value of water from that, like when the water is contaminated? And what I'm getting at is the instance we have in the Lake Elmo Woodbury area where PFAS is contaminated so much the aquifer, you can no longer use the water there safely. So how is that, those kind of considerations considered in your value of water right now, or are they not considered in the value of water right now?
That's an excellent question. What I didn't present on were some of the methods economists use to estimate there's two categories. There's avoided costs, there's treatment costs, and then there's health impacts of exposure to contaminated water. On the treatment cost side of things, we do actually have data for a variety of different contaminants, especially for nitrates, how much cities and municipalities have to pay if their water supply is contaminated, as well as the cost that private households have to incur if their water supply is contaminated. So I live in an agricultural watershed. I have a reverse osmosis system under my sink, right? I have to pay to maintain that. And so that's a cost that's borne by households. So yes, the short answer is we do have values for the treatment costs and costs that households have to pay for contaminated water. Overall, those costs are relatively small, added up across especially if you're thinking about the cost of taking lands out of production or regulation of agricultural contaminants, which can be quite expensive. But there are costs associated with those treatment options for households and municipalities. The other thing that you raised, which is critically important, but we have not done a good job of quantifying, is what happens when someone's exposed to contaminated water and they have health impacts as a result. The biggest limitation there is that we don't have good epidemiological data for all contaminants and how they affect incidences of cancer, birth defects, et cetera. If we can quantify those and monetize those impacts, then those often result in very large estimates of benefits. It's one of the reasons that air quality policies have shown such positive return on investment, because they've been so closely linked with solid epidemiological work to certain types of cancer. So that's the short answer. We should be doing more. It's going to require a partnership with public health in order to do that.
And the other question that I would have that, excuse me, Mr. Chair, it's okay if I continue?
Oh, yes, go right ahead, Representative.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Killer. The other question I have on it is, what about the lost business costs? And I'll use the example of out in Lake Elmo. There's two things they're getting crunched on, but they have suspended all land development out there. Part of it is because wells they have that are available they could use are contaminated. So as a result, homes that were going to be built, businesses that were going to go in are not going to happen now. So how is that captured in the equation? Because to me, that all of a sudden starts causing some very extreme costs that start rising up, opportunity costs that are implicated down the road.
Yeah, excellent question. So in general, economists in that situation would want to know, are those businesses moving elsewhere? Or are they just, so is the loss local to the Lake Elmo community, but actually those are being relocated elsewhere and another community is sort of benefiting from the fact that they have clean water elsewhere that they can use? So then overall, the net economic impact hasn't actually changed. It's just moved from one location to another. If contaminated water has led to a decline in businesses across the region, then we would count that as a net loss of economic welfare. So the question is it causing dislocation to other industries? There's communities who are benefiting, communities who are losing, versus are we overall reducing the amount of economic activity in the state or region? And those are sometimes difficult to disentangle, but that's the sort of trick in estimating economic impacts on an industry.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. Keeler. And I also want to say thank you to all the testifiers. The information we've been getting to is phenomenal. I appreciate that. And then, Mr. Chair, I was wondering if I could, I've got a question or two for Ms. Ross then.
Yes, go right ahead, Representative Fisher.
Thank you, Chair Poston. To Ms. Ross, I want to say thank you for the work that you folks have been doing for the water supply, taking a look at the entire regions out there. What I'm wondering is, your first report came out in 2015. I know it takes a lot of work to pull these things together. I'm wondering, with what you've learned now, what are some of the things that you folks are going to be able to do going forward with these reports to address what's happened in the Northeast Metro? And because we are in the unique situation right now, besides the contamination that's happening in Lake Elmo, they and other communities also being sandwiched by the fact that the DNR has come out and said that there is not enough water, groundwater, to use in a sustainable way. And they're recommending that all permits be pulled. they're recommending that water be cut off from all businesses and that the only people who could get water would be actual homeowners themselves. And wondering is, now that we know some of those dynamics out there, how will the water supply, the things that you folks are working on, how are you going to take that to help address the issue that we now have in the Northeast Metro that has already led to Lake Elmo banning all construction, putting a moratorium on all home and business construction and other communities considering it?
Thank you for the appreciation first and for this very rich question. This is something that I and my leadership and colleagues across the council have been following very closely. And I would offer as well, if it would be helpful, my manager Ali Al-Hassan is also here and may want to chime in. But I'm gonna start from the guidance we got from our Water Supply Advisory Committee, and some of the guidance and priorities that we heard from them are to, based on the technical work that we've been doing, as reported in our 2015 Master Water Supply Plan and in our other projects we've been doing since then, we have a better understanding of some of the interactions in the system. So having more informed conversations and doing more informed work to understand the different hazards and to understand the risks more clearly. We've also been doing a lot of relationship building over those years. And one thing we heard very clearly from the advisory committee was support for continuing to bring people together, make sure that they have the capacity, the information, the time commitment to come together and have more, wrestle more with these questions. So we support that, and to continue to support this sub-regional approach to clarifying what are our shared goals, what are the trade-offs that we can or can't make, and so to support that sub-regional work. So those are some of the pieces that I think we're much better to set up to do and that we're hearing would add value. And as we go into these conversations about updating our regional plans and policies, we've heard very clearly too the need to continue working more closely together to collaborate and iterate around some of those land use and water supply, the consequences. So we're not coming up with unintended consequences. Again, we understand the system better than we did before. So I'll hold there. I see Ali has stepped up if he's wants to add.
Mr. Allison, you have something to add?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to add that Met Council since 2015, we realized that many of the communities are and actually they asked us to help with the water efficiency. And that's why we created a grant program. And thank you for the state. Thank you for all of you for approving the grant program for us that we received through the Clean Water Fund, that we distribute that money to the communities. We have been the only agency that provide actual money to solve some of the communities' issues in the East Metro. In the last 2 rounds of the water efficiency grants, most of the communities who took advantage of our program are communities from the Northeast Metro. They have received more than 50%, 55% actually of the money that's available for all the communities. They are the ones who are taking the initiative to apply for the program. They are the ones who are trying to implement water efficiency measures, and they have been successful in that. And so we have been working with the communities. And a good example of that, and this is just going back to the question by Senator Whipper about the Lake Elmo situation. We understand, and we are providing a lot of resources to city of Lake Elmo. As of yesterday, we have a meeting with the city administrator and one of their city councils. And we have been working with them in providing some of the technical support that they needed from us, from the Met Council. So we have been addressing some of these specific local issues. And we are trying in the future also, as part of our planning for the year 2050, take into consideration some of these new changes. When we developed the Master Water Supply Plan in 2015, there was no court decision. So that was not a limitation there. So we made our planning based on the information that's available for us at that time. Now going into 2050 and in the next 2 years, and knowing what will happen in the north and east and how this issue is going to be resolved or being addressed, we will be taking into consideration, especially when in the connection between land use and water use, will be taken into consideration any outcomes of this court decision. But we have been working with the communities. We have been trying to provide help for the communities. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, sir. Representative Fisher.
Thank you, Chair Poston. Appreciate it. And thank you, Hassan, for the work that you folks are doing. I know a lot of this work that you're doing right now, is newer stuff. We haven't had the science out there. We haven't had the understanding of water models to forecast where we are now. And as a result, the information that you folks are getting is helping guide your processes. Am I correct? Is that for the most part, Met Council is not able to mandate anybody using different water systems? The thing you can only facilitate conversations. Is that correct? How does the Met Council work with that component?
Mr. Chair, if I might answer that question.
Yes, Mr. Ellison, go right ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Representative Fisher. Met Council is a regional planning agency for water supply. We are not a system. We don't have an authority to mandate anything. Our approach for work with the communities is to maximize the local control of the systems. We wanted the communities to take full local control of their systems and make the decisions. Our job comes when we are providing good information so that communities can make good decisions when they are managing their systems. So that's, and we are trying also, our second main important thing is to bring that regional perspective. As you know, water doesn't follow political boundaries. It's not stopped at the boundary of one city. It crosses all of the cities. So we really need to bring that. And this is part of the value of the work that the Met Council is providing is, as example, the aquifers that's shared in the north and east is shared by all of the communities. We needed to bring that regional perspective and regional understanding of the resources and the impact of the collective use of the resources to all the communities so that they can make their own local decision. So our support is convening, being a convener. We have been successful in convening so many different groups around the metro area. We have 7 active sub-regional groups that have been working over the last 15 years. And these groups have been working into addressing some of their local issues in a collaborative manner. Our job mainly was convener, consultant, and providing information for them.
Thank you, sir. Representative Fisher?
Thank you, Chair Post, and thank you, Mr. Ellison, for your explanations there. It's kind of, it's great that you folks are out there doing the work as the conveners. I know that sometimes I sense from some of the communities up in that area, there are some communities who are doing incredible work to address the water supply up there. An example would be Hugo's, how they've grown substantially and at the same time cut their water use incredibly by their reuse of stormwater, et cetera. And it's great to see communities doing that. And I want to make sure that, and I know that as you folks have been working with them, that you've been very supportive of the efforts that they have, and I appreciate the communities who are doing that great work. The question that comes in, and this is a thought, I know this is something that Met Council cannot mandate or anything, but I know there are some communities up in the area who are very resistant, who could probably with minimum investment be able to go to surface water and provide that groundwater availability to other communities. When you run into communities like that, how best can we approach that type of thing when we've got some feeling that they can ignore what's going on and try to stay where they are? Any thoughts on how we can better address those type of situations, or how do we facilitate a conversation for them to understand how they can better help their fellow communities?
Mr. Ellison or Mrs. Ross?
I will take a first stab on that, and I will let Lania to continue that. In the previous success stories that we have with different regional groups where they have some of these issues, we started with having an identification of a problem. What's the problem from the standpoint of the cities, rather than the regulators, rather than the regional planning agencies, but from the communities' standpoint, how they see the problem and what's the problem and how it's affecting them. And that's when we started the discussion. That's always the first point for us, is to identify the problem, come up with a statement of problem that everyone accepting. And that's when we started with the community's help, based on their local experiences and their local resources, developing some solutions that match, fit their regional issues, sub-regional issues. And some of these good examples is what will happen in the Southwest Metro. When we have the issues in the early 2000s with the fence in Savage Fen, and the community was not able, their permit to drill more wells was denied by the DNR. And that discussion, when we have convened that group of communities in the early 2000s, and we worked with them, that resulted in the big collaboration between Burnsville and Savage, that resulted on communities reaching out to the state, getting help from the state to resolve some of these issues, building alternative water supply, and sustainably, since 2009, providing water to both Burnsville and Savage from the quarry in that area. So I think we have in some of the historic achievements and success stories that could be applicable in other places in the region. But also there is good models that actually the settlement agreement, the PFAS settlement agreement, I would call it that, in the North and East, in the East Metro, the collaborative model that have been used by the DNR and PCA is really one of the good models that could be applicable to address some of these issues. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, sir. Anything to add, Mrs. Ross?
No, Ali stole my thunder. I was going to highlight, I think there's some good lessons learned. Southwest Metro is one that comes to mind for me. I was working with the Shakopee Mdewakanton Sioux community at the time. And I think good success stories and also knowledge transfer. There were pieces that maybe could have been done differently in that work that we may be able to learn from and share. So I appreciated Ali's highlight of those good.
Thank you very much. Anything else, Representative Fisher?
No, thank you, Chair Poston, and thank you both, Ms. Ross and Mr. Alazan. Appreciate your opportunity to be here and helping us to have a better understanding of the process, and look forward to the work that you folks will be starting to do, or I should say continuing to do, in the East and Northeast Metro as we're tackling the issues that we have up in that area.
Thank you, Representative. Mr. Stark, I don't have any further hands up for questions, so I think we'll move on to your legislative update.
Yes, let's see. Are you seeing my screen?
Yes, sir.
For some reason I'm not able to. There we go. Thank you. So first, I'd like to thank the speakers for their presentations today. You did a wonderful job, stayed in time, and I think we've raised a lot of questions here that we don't have time to answer. So I'll reach out to them and ask them for a couple of bullet points from their presentations, and then get it back to the members, and if you have questions, we can get them answered in that way. So you'll see that coming from me shortly. We talked about these issues. There's a lot of water issues in Minnesota. It seems like the issues in the Northeast Metro have come to bear. It's kind of a convergence between the court order around White Bear Lake now, and then the PFAS issue to the south, and those kind of are converging. And I think that deserves additional discussion in a next meeting. Just very briefly, status of the bills that came from this committee. Many of them, the ones that are underlined here, have had hearings. Some of them are moving forward. Some of them are moving forward as parts of other bills, or similar kinds of actions in other bills. So I'll have a summary for you, and I think we'll talk about these in detail at our next meeting. I expect that we probably won't be able to meet now until after session. I can send something up, but I'm guessing that would be hard. So we will have a wrap up after session. Unfortunately, several of you have decided not to run for office again. So I hope to be able to get a little bit of time with all of you in the next month or so, just to get your impressions on the work of the committee, to ask you what you think works and what doesn't work so well from this committee. And I hope we can have a discussion about that after session ends. So with that, I guess, thank you again. Thanks to the members for being here. I really appreciate that. And particularly to the speakers. So, Mr. Chair, with that, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Stark. Thank you to all the presenters, and thank you, members, for being on the call today. And with that, we're adjourned.
Thank you.
Have a good day, everybody.